Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thanks, Josh, for getting us set up. My name is Blake Zachary. I use he and him pronouns, and I'll be one of your facilitators today. I am the Deputy Chief of Data Quality at the Demographic and Health Surveys, or DHS for short, DHS program. We understand that some of you are having trouble with the annotations, and so we apologize for that, but we do see your notes, and we are glad to see folks joining us from across the world. French interpretation is available. If you go in your Zoom window at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a button that says interpretation. If you click that and then click on the French channel, you'll hear the French interpretation of our presentation, which will be in English today. Later on, if you want to ask questions in French, feel free, and we'll have them interpreted into English and answer in English. Also note that the session today is being recorded, and the recording will be publicly available on the DHS program's YouTube channel later. We're excited to see such robust participation, but due to the size of the webinar and the sensitive nature of the content, we've put in place a few precautions to minimize any inappropriate context while encouraging active participation. So you'll notice the chat function has been disabled during this webinar. We may share links or some information with you, but you won't be able to send messages back to us or to each other. We do want to hear your questions and comments, so please use the Q&A pod. Submissions are visible to everyone, and you can upvote other submissions to indicate your interest to their questions or submit your own. Facilitators will select questions from the pod to be answered verbally after we conduct the presentation. We have enabled chat etiquette in Zoom for the Q&A pod, which is a list of offensive or inappropriate words that will be automatically blocked. If you try to send a message that violates this policy, Zoom will display a prompt stating that the message can't be sent because of the chat etiquette policies. The DHS program staff will be monitoring the Q&A pod and deleting any content deemed offensive or inappropriate that was not screened excuse me, by the chat etiquette policies. We are also keeping everyone muted during the webinar, but during the discussion portion, you are free to raise your hand to indicate that you would like to speak, and we will call on you. At that time, we ask that you give your name and organization and then your comment or question. We again ask everyone to please use respectful language and feel free to speak in either English or French. Later on in the webinar, we may ask some folks to speak. You may receive a prompt asking you if you'd like to unmute or stay muted. You can accept or reject that request to speak and let us know your preference at that time. And then finally, the DHS program reserves the right to remove anyone from the webinar if their behavior is offensive or inappropriate. We hope that doesn't happen today. Let's move on to a review of the agenda. So this is an overview of today's webinar. Following our welcome, we'll be watching a brief video clip about the DHS survey process. And then Carrie McCory and I will give a presentation on collecting data on gender and sexual minorities in the DHS program surveys. This will be followed by a question and answer session. So any of your questions about the presentation or anything else that has come up during the session, please use the Q&A pod. Again, you can vote on other people's responses or submit your own. Following that, we'll have a discussion on perceived data gaps and needs. And this will be guided by your responses to your survey. Thank you everyone who filled that out. We have reviewed all of that. And any submissions right now to the Q&A pod. So finally, we'll wrap up by sharing some of our planned next steps. But first, we'd like to invite the DHS program's USAID contract officer, Kristen Wares, to make some welcoming remarks. So Kristen, welcome.
Thanks so much, Blake. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Blake said, my name is Kristen Wares. I'm the COR of the DHS program. I sit at USAID Washington in the Office of Population and Reproductive Health. As many of you know, the Demographic and Health Surveys program is a USAID-funded project that has provided support and technical assistance to over 90 countries worldwide in the implementation of more than 400 population and health surveys since 1984. DHS program surveys use standard methodology to be comparable across countries and over time. Localization has long been a core priority of the DHS program. Surveys are country-led. For each survey in each country, a steering or technical committee comprised of national government representatives and survey donors assess local data needs and make decisions about the survey scope for that country and that survey with guidance from a DHS program survey designer and using the DHS core questionnaire. Surveys are then conducted by the local implementing agency, typically the National Statistical Office. During the questionnaire design, as I said, DHS program core questionnaires are adapted. There's a core questionnaire that's used, but it can be adapted to meet the needs of the country based on the priorities that were determined by the steering or technical committee. So the government ministries, country program, NGOs, and funding agencies. The DHS collected by DHS program surveys are publicly available and designed to be used for the creation, monitoring, and evaluation of programs and policies to improve health and well-being. You may be wondering, why is the DHS program hosting this webinar? Well, first, as a leading source of information on gender in survey countries, we hope to raise awareness about how information on gender is collected in DHS program surveys and share examples of surveys that have collected data on gender and sexual minorities. Second, inclusion is a priority for USAID and the Bureau of Global Health. In 2014, USAID released a Vision for Action statement promoting and supporting the inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals, which identified the collection of quantitative and qualitative data that address the experiences of LGBT persons as a relatively simple and inexpensive entry point for inclusion. And just this week, we're excited that USAID released our updated gender equality and women's empowerment policy, and there is increased investments in gender programming. Another key focus area for the Bureau of Global Health is youth health and well-being, including improved programming for diverse and marginalized youth, including LGBTQI+ youth. It is important that this work be done in an inclusive and evidence-based way. And this webinar is the first step in developing recommendations for the inclusion of sexual and gender minorities in DHS program surveys when and where stakeholders expressed interest in this topic. There is much for us to learn from the global community. We're eager to hear your perceived data gaps in this area, as well as learn more about your experiences collecting gender and sexual minority data in surveys. Thank you everyone for joining us, for sharing your time and sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. Back to Blake. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kristen, for those remarks. As Kristen mentioned, the DHS program has been conducting surveys since 1984 and uses a standard methodology to be comparable across countries and over time. So the DHS survey can be roughly divided into 4 stages, and that entire process can take up to 2.5 years. Stage 1 is the first step in any survey, which includes the design and preparation. Stage 2 is when fieldworker training and data collection occur. Stage 3 covers the editing of data and tabulation of the results. And finally, in stage 4 is when the final report and data sets are released publicly and additional data use activities are conducted. Now together, we want to watch an excerpt from a video that will be covering stages 1 and 2. You can view this full video on the DHS program's YouTube channel, where the video is available in English, French, and Portuguese. So go ahead and push play, please.
During the design stage, the USAID mission, a national government, or another donor invites the DHS program staff to visit the country. The DHS Senior Survey Coordinator works with national government representatives and survey donors to assess local data needs, raise funds, and plan for the survey. They make decisions about the survey scope, including sample size, topic-specific modules, and biomarkers to include in the survey. The DHS Senior Survey Coordinator also works with the local implementing implementing agency, typically the National Statistical Office, to develop the budget for the survey. They select a local lab, often the National Reference Laboratory, based on its capacity and areas of expertise, to conduct lab-based testing of blood or other specimen types to be collected in the survey. Next, a DHS program sampling statistician works with the implementing agency to design a sample that represents the population at the national level, urban and rural areas, and the first subnational administrative unit of the country, often a state or province. The standard DHS survey uses 5 questionnaires: the household questionnaire, the woman's questionnaire, the man's questionnaire, the biomarker questionnaire, and a 5th questionnaire, the field worker questionnaire, which collects information about the field workers themselves. The team adapts the DHS core questionnaires to the needs of the country based on the priorities of the government ministries, country programs, NGOs, and funding agencies. Questionnaires are translated into local languages. The team then pre-tests the survey instruments, which involves training a small group of field workers and then testing the questionnaires in up to several hundred households. Based on the pre-test, they make modifications to the survey and training materials. Stage 2 begins with household mapping and listing. Listers go to each cluster and make a detailed map and numerical list of all the structures in the cluster, and within occupied structures, a list of all households. Geographical coordinates are also collected. From this listing, the DHS program team then randomly selects households to participate in the survey. The DHS program team trains between 100 to 400 field workers as interviewers, team supervisors, and biomarker technicians. They receive training on topics ranging from building rapport with respondents, questionnaire content, computerized data collection, and reading maps to identify selected households. Biomarker technicians receive training in anthropometry, hemoglobin measurement, and other biomarkers, and on completing the biomarker questionnaire, informed consent, and returning test results. The trainings culminate in several days of field practice during which teams try out all aspects of fieldwork prior to the launch of the survey. Trainers evaluate the trainees, and top performers become the field staff for the DHS survey. When the survey launches, teams of field workers travel across the country to begin data collection. Depending on the composition of the household, an interviewer can spend a half a day or more in a single household. The woman's questionnaire alone takes 45 minutes on average. In some households, more than one woman is eligible for interview. Interviewers ask respondents questions and enter their responses into tablet computers. Data are transferred from the interviewer's tablet to the supervisor's tablet for review, and then to the central office.
So with that overview in mind, we wanted to also start with a common understanding of some of the terms that we will be using today. We recognize that these terms may mean something different in other contexts or cultures, so this brief description is how we are using these words today. Next slide, please. The gingerbread person is an image created by Sam Kellerman and is a helpful guide here, I think. You can find this resource on genderbread.org. So this image shows 5 domains of human experience: gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, sexual attraction, and romantic attraction. The arrows, back please to biological sex. The arrows represent a continuum or degree in which someone may identify with each element, the left side representing no identification with that element. So if we look at sex as a biological characteristic, it refers to anatomy, DNA, hormones, and is typically assigned at birth on the observation of external physical characteristics. Because of this, it's commonly referred to as one's sex assigned at birth. Biological sex exists on a spectrum, with most people falling into either primarily female or primarily male. Intersex refers to someone with both female and male characteristics. Next. Gender, on the other hand, is how one identifies with what they see as the gender options in society and how they express that identity. For most people, the sex assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity. And for this, we use the adjective cisgender, for these people. That means that gender and sex are on the same side. When a person's gender identity is different from the sex they were assigned at birth, we use the adjective transgender. A transgender person may identify as a woman, as a man, as both, or as neither. Many of the questions in a DHS survey focus on biology, especially for women. For example, reproductive histories, menstruation, breastfeeding. However, interviewers do not confirm a respondent's biological sex, but rather rely on the reported gender. Next slide. Sexual orientation is distinct from gender identity and from sex, because sexual orientation describes who someone is sexually, romantically, and/or physically attracted to. We commonly use the term homosexual or gay or lesbian for those attracted to the same gender. And as Kristen mentioned, the acronym LGBT, which stands for lesbian, gay, transgender, is an acronym covering that broad category. The term heterosexual or straight is often used for those attracted to a different gender. And bisexual is a term used to describe those attracted to both genders. However, these terms can be problematic when we consider the individuals whose gender identity may not fit within a man-woman binary. Sexual behavior, on the other hand, is merely a description of how someone has sex and whom they're having sex with. For example, a heterosexual man could have sex with other men, but may not specifically identify as gay. Ultimately, sex, gender, sexual behavior, and sexual orientation all exist along a spectrum and independent from one another. These identities can also change throughout one's life. Individuals who identify as transgender are sometimes called gender minorities, since the majority of people identify as cisgender. And individuals who do not identify as heterosexual are sometimes called sexual minorities. We're referring to this group of people collectively as sexual and gender minorities. Another term would be LGBTQ as an acronym. So with that terminology defined here, I'd like to introduce Carrie McCory. She's the DHS Program Senior Advisor for Research and Analysis. She's a trained social demographer and has been with the DHS program for the past 11 years. She'll be sharing how the DHS program approaches the topic of gender and sexual behavior in a standard survey. And then we'll discuss specific examples of surveys where they have been adapted to address these assumptions. So, Carrie.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I would like to follow on Kristen Ware's earlier comments and the video clip where we talked about the standard DHS procedures and data collection tools. And I'd like to begin my portion of the presentation with just a caveat that in my slides, I will be discussing the standard DHS program, the way our data collection tools and procedures are typically administered in any given survey. Later on, we'll be talking about some exceptions and customizations that we have done, but I'll be talking generally about the standard way that we have implemented our surveys. So I wanted to go to sort of the beginning of the DHS program and think a little bit upon how it is that we have conceptualized gender within the DHS program from its beginning. The DHS program is a successor program to earlier demographic data collection initiatives like the contraceptive prevalence surveys and the World Fertility Surveys of the 1970s. As such, this grounding in demography and the ways in which the field of demography conceptualized gender is very much a part of DHS's origin story. The discipline of demography has, for quite some time, grappled what is sometimes referred to as the two-sex problem. The two-sex problem can be described in any number of ways, but one basic understanding of this is the recognition that fertility and reproduction requires two people, one who produces ova and one who produces sperm. And this generates a fundamental question in terms of calculating demographic rates, particularly fertility rates, which is a consideration of what is the correct denominator for constructing these rates. The answer to this conundrum is fairly easily available to us, and the demography field has quite quickly come to the conclusion that all necessary information for most fertility rates can be obtained from women. The one exception might be the crude birth rate, but all of our total fertility rates, our general fertility rates, our age-specific fertility rates, and so on, we really can do those based solely on information we obtain from women. So the resolution to this two-sex problem lies in a focus on women and women as the data collection point. Next slide, please. What are the implications of focusing on women in this way? Well, first of all, it means that at its inception, the DHS program largely ignored men. Second, the construction of gender has been with two binary categories, women or men, male or female. Those are the two options distinct from one another without recognition of this broad space among different categories. Does not differentiate between cisgender or transgender any further than that. And so you've got this binary construction that we have fallen into. With regard to sexual orientation, because of the focus on demographic rates and reproduction, leads us to being concerned primarily about sexual intercourse for women with men. And this reinforces heterosexual norms about the type of relationships and partnerships and the type of sexual activity that people are engaged in. Next slide, please. However, this singular focus on women in the DHS program did not last for long. One of the first evolutions in considering gender was expanding the DHS surveys to include men's interviews. Recall from the video clip that there are now 5 questionnaires in the standard DHS, but it wasn't always so. The household questionnaire and the women's individual questionnaire, however, have been a part of the standard DHS survey since its inception in 1984. The first man's questionnaire arrived on the scene fairly shortly after in 1987. And this coincided with the DHS program broadening the set of health issues that it examined and an inquiry into the broader social context in which health outcomes were being observed. And a lot of this came from recognition that men, their attitudes and their behavior influence women's fertility behavior and outcomes as well. This expansion coincided with these movements, and now the men's survey is a part of almost every DHS survey that is implemented. This map, this visualization, is coming from a Tableau dashboard that we have on the DHS website, showing the evolution of the DHS program. The size of the circles on this map indicate the number of surveys in a given country that have included men. And as you can see, we have circles of varying sizes in almost every DHS survey country. Next. What have we learned from including men's surveys? Well, the inclusion of men's interviews as a part of the standard DHS has been a real boon to the available data that we have on gender around the world, particularly in low and middle income countries. The inclusion of the men's questionnaire has facilitated a substantial amount of analysis on a wide array of research topics, from looking at impacts on women's behavior and women's health outcomes, to men's own fertility attitudes and health needs, health disparities between women and men, an examination of gender dynamics within households, focus on gender-based violence, as well as a whole range around of analyses around discordance, or where there are different responses from women and men regarding fertility desires, decision-making, and much more. And I can't leave this topic without giving a plug for the couples data files, or the CR data files. If you're a researcher who uses DHS data sets for statistical analyses, you should know about these. These are files where we have put together responses from women and from men when each partner reports that the other person is their spouse or cohabiting partner. So this is a data set where women's and men's responses are together as one case. So you can analyze as couples rather than as women or men in particular. Okay, next slide, please. Nonetheless, despite this really impressive evolution, gender is still constructed as a binary in the DHS program. There's no further distinction among gender identities in terms of gender expression. And we retain the assumption that relationships are generally with someone of a different gender. How are gender data typically collected in standard DHS instruments? It's important to note that these data are collected from the household questionnaire. So recalling the various questionnaires that comprise the standard DHS, we have the household questionnaire, the individual woman's, the individual man's, and so on. Gender data is collected in the household questionnaire. As shown in this snippet, sorry, if you could go back. Yeah, as shown in this snippet, for each person that's listed in the household roster, the interviewer asks, as you can see in column 4, is, they insert the full name, male or female, and they record the response that's given by the household respondent. So information provided by in the household questionnaire is provided by the respondent to the household questionnaire. This need not be the head of the household. It can be any adult who resides in the house who's knowledgeable about the household and the household members. This means that for a number of people, there's a third-party report for gender. So someone in the household is reporting what everyone's gender is, and that's a third-party report for all residents except for the household respondent themselves. Thanks. So why are gender data collected in the household questionnaire rather than one of the individual questionnaires? There are two goals for placing it here. The first goal is because we want to collect important household data for the population in general so that we can estimate population structure and to facilitate analysis of household characteristics, structure, and address family demography research questions. Next. The second goal is to identify persons who are eligible for those individual interviews and to direct eligible respondents to either the woman's or the man's questionnaire. This eligibility criteria is based on gender and the age range that they fall into generally. Next. So this is just a visual describing that process. And the household respondent is reporting the gender as either a binary female or male, and that directs them into the relevant questionnaire. Note, as Blake mentioned earlier, these gender data that are collected in the household questionnaire are not reconfirmed in either the woman's or the man's questionnaire. And this means that in some instances, the household respondent may be mistaken about the individual's gender identity, or they may provide an incorrect gender identity intentionally in an attempt to protect that person. And when the person's identity does not fall neatly within the male-female binary categories that we provide, The household respondent is forced to choose a category that might not be completely accurate for that individual. In the standard DHS, there is not an explicit way for the individual woman or man to correct any such inaccuracy. Next. How are data on sexual partners collected in the standard DHS? Well, unlike gender identity data, these data are collected in the individual man's or the individual woman's questionnaire. These snippets to the right provide an example. They're in a category, a section of the questionnaire on marriage and sexual behavior. And for women, the questions that are asked are as follows. Are you currently married or, currently married or living together with a man as if married? And then further in that section, what was your, and this is referring to the most recent sexual intercourse, what was your relationship to this person with whom you had sexual intercourse? Husband, live-in partner, boyfriend, not living with respondent, casual acquaintance, client, sex worker, or other. Similarly for men are asked if they are currently married or living together with a woman, as if married. And about their sexual relationships, their sexual partners, they're offered options to respond, such as wife, girlfriend, and so on. This assumes that, again, relationships or sexual intercourse are generally with someone of a different gender. Next slide. So where are data on gender minorities in the standard DHS? Gender minorities are not excluded from DHS data. They are there because every eligible individual does get interviewed. However, we have been tolerating for quite some time some degree of misclassification errors. This misclassification means that sometimes people are given the wrong category for what their real attributes are. So in every individual in the household is assigned to one of two binary options in the household questionnaire. And if they're of eligible age, they're interviewed with one of these questionnaires. If the household respondent provides an accurate gender classification, as is possible, some people may end up in quote unquote, the wrong data file. That is a data file that doesn't necessarily match with their gender identity, but they are there in the data. We just don't know how many this pertains to. People with other gender identities beyond the two binary options that we offer also get interviewed, but we don't know which data file that they end up in, or how many people this applies to. So as a result, gender minorities exist, but they are rendered invisible in DHS data. I just want to acknowledge that it appears we're having some challenges with the French translation interpretation at the moment. We're working on that, and we're going to see if we can get that cleaned up for everyone. Next slide, Josh. Okay. Where are data on sexual minorities in the standard DHS? Sexual minorities are also interviewed in standard DHS surveys. Most questions on sexual behavior and relationships, however, are not worded in a way that is particularly relevant for sexual minorities. Individuals who are sexually active or are in relationships with someone of the same gender may appear to be not sexually active at all or not in a partnership because of the wording of the questions in the standard DHS. The implications of this are that data on the experiences of sexual minorities are largely excluded from DHS data. In conclusion, In conclusion, and next slide, in conclusion, gender is still constructed as a binary in standard DHS surveys. No further distinction is made among gender identities, and we retain the assumptions that relationships are generally with someone of a different gender. This means that increasingly data on gender and sexual minorities from DHS standard surveys do not accurately reflect the world that we live in. At the DHS program, we continue to make strides towards conceptualizing gender more inclusively and capturing better, more accurate data from and about gender and sexual minorities. As we reflect on some of the limitations of the standard DHS data collection approaches and consider how to improve our procedures, we've had some opportunities along the way to implement different approaches in response to particular country needs. So some of these different approaches, I am pleased to now turn over to Blake again, who will talk a little bit about some of these unique non-standard data collection experiences that we've had in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. And I believe the issue with the is with the closed captioning. So just a reminder, if you would like to hear the audio translated into French, to click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen and click on the French channel, not the closed caption. The translation is live by a person, and you can hear the audio. So as Carrie said, every survey goes through some level of adaptation from that standard that she described, and we want to share some examples of surveys that have done this adaptation in order to address some of those assumptions around sexual behavior and or gender identity. So to date, we have 12 surveys that have included some sort of modification to account for and or measure topics related to sexual and gender minorities. But each survey has done this in a somewhat different way. So we'll go through a few examples. Next slide. 9 surveys have included same gender sexual behavior questions to men alone. You can see here an example question from the Philippines asking men if they've ever had sex with a man. These survey-specific questions were usually added at the request of the HIV sector in order to improve their programming. Cambodia is the only country so far that's included these questions in multiple surveys, and the Philippines in 2003 was the only survey that was able to tabulate these results in the final report. The table on the right presents the percentage of men ever who have had sex with another man and those that have had sex with another man in the past year. The other surveys in this group have used similar sort of questions. We move to the next example. The DHS in India in 2019 and 21 is also called the National Family and Health Survey, or NFHS. They included a third gender option in the household schedule. In English here referred to as transgender, but actually covering a wide range of identities in India. So the questionnaire at the household level in the upper right has been modified from that standard that you saw by including a third gender option at the household level. However, individuals who were identified as third gender persons were not individually interviewed because, as Carrie mentioned, we only have a woman and a man's questionnaire at this time. So something that we're thinking through. In India, the disability information was collected at the household level for all household members. And in the final report, third gender individuals were shown separately from males and females in the table that you can see on the screen, again with the label here as transgender, covering that broad category. And this table is the percentage of individuals who have a disability. The next slide. In South Africa, the parliament legalized same-gender marriages back in 2006. And so for this reason, the government stakeholders felt that the DHS survey should allow for this in the questionnaire. So here you can see that the question on marriage was changed to not refer to a specific gender, and then to ask explicitly what is the gender of the person in that partnership with the individual. These people were included together with the standard category of as married or living together as if married, but no other further modifications to the tables were added to the final report. In the next example, please. The 2015 Columbia DHS included a wide range of survey-specific adaptations related to sexual and gender and minority person and/or topics. To our knowledge, this is the first national level survey in Latin America to include these topics. These questions are in Spanish. The DHS program provided minimal technical assistance because of the strong capacity of Pro Familia, which is the implementing agency in Colombia. And for further context, transgender individuals in Colombia over the age of 18 were granted the right to change their legal gender in 2015, and same-gender marriage was legalized in 2016. So that, no, sorry, go back one. Back one slide, please. Can you go back? There you go. All right. So this example here is the household roster. So you can see here again that the question was changed to remove any reference to gender, and then the options were expanded to include male, female, trans male, and trans female. As we mentioned, the household questionnaire is administered to an informed household respondent, and for that case, most individuals are not reporting for themselves, they're reporting for everyone who lives in the household. So in Colombia, they addressed this issue by including in the individual questionnaire as the very first question, a confirmation of the gender identified at the household level. So this question in English reads, since we are surveying both men and women, I need to ask you the following question to determine the type of questionnaire to administer. Are you a man, a woman, a transgender woman, or a transgender man? So this gave the opportunity for the individual to clarify in case the gender assigned at the household level was not consistent with their own identity. In Colombia, though, there were still just two questionnaires, one for women and one for men. The next slide. At the individual level, along with a number of other questions, there was a direct question on sexual orientation, and the response options here in English are heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. The questions about sex and marriage included a full marriage history for each person and all of their previous relationships, and for each of those relationships, the gender of the partner was explicitly asked. When they're asking about sexual intercourse, the questions have been modified to ask explicitly about vaginal intercourse and anal intercourse separately. And those are the two questions that you see at the bottom of your screen. And finally, all respondents were asked their opinions on the rights of LGBT individuals across Colombia. And the final report included several tables on these topics, including tables on sexual orientation of respondents, partnership status, and the attitudes towards the LGBT population. So the results of this survey were then used to inform an inclusive adolescent sexual health initiative, amongst many other outcomes from the survey. So next slide. As the DHS program looks back at these surveys and we think through some of the best ways that we can standardly incorporate these topics in future surveys and areas that we can improve, we have already documented some key considerations. So a huge concern is the legality, the legal issue, both for same-gender sexual relationships and transgender identity in any country that's conducting a DHS. Next slide. This map is from the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association, and it's an excellent resource. They have very detailed information about every country in the world. And this map here is just showing countries that have criminalized same-gender sexual behavior with a range of punishments, as you can see here, from from no criminalization to punishments including prison all the way up to the death penalty. So as the DHS program, and hopefully universally, we agree that the safety and security of any respondents to a survey must come first. And so we want to keep this in mind as any survey is considering country-specific modifications. Next slide, please. This map gives a sense of the range of legal status for changing gender identity across the world. And so in some places you can see here that all it requires is to self-identify, to say this is the gender I identify with. In other places, there are different requirements, including up to a confirmation of gender-affirming surgical care. So it's important to keep this landscape in mind during the survey design, because even if there are no laws restricting sexual and gender minorities in a country, there can still be tremendous shame and stigma around this topic, around these topics. But this is not insurmountable. Other topics assessed by the DHS similarly share this challenge. For example, domestic violence experience, female genital cutting, and abortion. Next slide. So assuming environment exists to ask these types of questions in a DHS survey, holder interest is still paramount. As Kristen outlined, and as we saw on the video, the DHS surveys are country-led. Program does not what is included or excluded in a particular survey. That is a concern the stakeholders part of the survey process. However, this program is providing guidance on how best to capture this information, the information that is the highest priority for the government and other stakeholders. In the case of South Africa and India, you can see the government requested the inclusion of these topics due to data collection requirements, mandates in law. But government directives are not the only rationale for making changes to a DHS survey. Health program implementers were a driving force behind the inclusion of same-gender sexual behavior questions, primarily, again, to inform the HIV prevention and treatment programs in those countries. And finally, a third key stakeholder are researchers. So in the example of Colombia, the researchers at the implementing agency, Pro Familia, were interested in understanding the LGBT landscape in the country at a time where there was great social change happening. As I mentioned, there were changes to laws about legal gender recognition and same-gender marriage laws. So understanding the cultural context is vital to identify the appropriate terminology to use and ensure that interviewer training is comprehensive. This means that individuals involved in the survey process with local knowledge need to be heavily involved in any questionnaire adaptation. And this is across the board because every DHS survey undergoes this adaptation for things like house facility classification, education levels, food groups, and terminology for specific questions that may be contextually unique. Recently, we've seen standard guidance come out in the United States and Europe around how to best include sexual and gender minorities in surveys, but what works in one country may not apply to all countries. It can be highly contextually specific. Across the board, though, a common constraint on any survey is, and the use of those results are small sample sizes. So a DHS survey is quite a large endeavor with usually fairly large sample sizes, but any rare events or relatively small population sizes within the general population mean that results of a survey may not always be informative. So how the data will be used needs to be taken into consideration very carefully by the stakeholders during the design phase. So in conclusion, the world is changing and surveys must change to adapt with it. The example of Colombia leading the way in Latin America is a great example. The National Statistical Agency, which is called DANE, after the 2015 survey, adopted a policy that all surveys in Colombia must include questions on sexual orientation and gender identity. And so recently, multiple surveys have come out that are able to tabulate results separately for sexual and gender minorities on topics including labor statistics and subjective well-being, among others. At the DHS program, we've also seen an increase in country-level stakeholders raising the issue during design of how and if sexual and gender minorities can be included in DHS surveys. So this is the reason that we are asking for your input and sharing our experiences in order to learn and guide our ultimately our recommendations on this topic. So that will conclude our presentation portion, and we want to hear from you. So we want to start with any questions that you have about the presentation, and then we'll turn to a discussion on your own experiences, if you have those in conducting surveys like this, and perceived data gaps and data needs across the world related to this topic. So as a reminder, please use the Q&A pod in Zoom to ask your questions or upvote other people's questions to indicate your interest in that question. And if you want to be called on, please raise your hand, and my colleagues Josh Durant, Belen Baya, and Sarah Balian are going to be assisting during this portion. Thank you.
Thank you, Blake and Carrie. I'm going to start us off with one of the questions that came in from the survey first, before we move to taking questions from the chat and from participants. So one important question that we saw over and over again is the DHS program under any obligation to include this topic in the survey questionnaire? Will there be an option for countries to decide to include questions on this topic, or will it be mandatory?
It's a really good question. All DHS surveys go through an adaptation process, and it's during this point in which any standard modules or any country-specific questions would be added. At this point, there is no mandatory questions around sexual and gender identity the DHS program has put together. But we are open to, as we've seen in these few examples, where there is those requirements met and where there is interest and strong plan on how to use those data to support a survey in adapting those in those ways.
So one of the questions we see in the chat is, how is the DHS program working with country statistic agencies, governments, civil society organizations to ensure that the questions on sexual minority are not in conflict with the law within the host country? And just a reminder that participants can use the raise their hand function if they'd like to ask a question verbally, and we will give you an opportunity to ask your question live.
Sarah, just to clarify that the question is if there's a conflict between the laws in a country and desire for survey modification.
Yeah, how is the DHS program working with country statistic agencies, governments, civil society organizations to ensure that questions on sexual minority are not in conflict with the law within the host country?
Yeah, again, a really good question, and these things are always very specific to the context and the situation at a given time. And so we would encourage all of the stakeholders during the design phase to consider all of these aspects of any possible change. And again, this relates to not only this topic, but other topics. And coming to a consensus on what is, both safe for the respondents and the interviewing teams that are in the field conducting the survey, as well as how these data will be used in the end. And so that has to be a discussion that happens amongst those stakeholders in that steering committee, who ultimately makes those final decisions on what would be included in the survey.
Could I follow up on that for just a moment? I'd just like to reiterate that at the core of everything that we're doing is, whether it's related to this topic or others, is making sure that we are collecting data ethically and that we are protecting the respondents that we interview. And so that means that there would need to be careful consideration of and pushback against any disclosure from the data that is not anonymized. Our data are reported and publicly available for public research purposes, but we do not pass on our data to other government entities, for instance. We make sure that all of the instruments in their design do not produce data that would disclose the location of any particular set of respondents, for instance. And so in evaluating what the legal landscape is against any questions, any modifications, we would always have that as the forefront of some of our discussions.
And if I could add one additional thing, it's important to remember that all DHS program surveys undergo Institutional Review Board IRB approval, both, so the survey protocol, both with ICF's Institutional Review Board in the United States, as well as the Institutional Review Board in the survey country. As a reminder, anyone can raise their hand to ask a question verbally. One question from the chat. I thought I understood that questions may be asked, but the results may not be in the final report. If that is the case, how does one know which surveys contain the questions? I asked this as a DHS user. So if the results aren't tabulated in the final report, how could a user know that these questions exist?
I can take that question if you like. As a data user myself and as a champion of everyone who uses our data, there are a number of different resources that I would point to for that. And I would just start off by clarifying that I think the point that was being made about further results not being tabulated and available in the final report really has to do with space in the final report and how much the final report covers. The data do not disappear and get cloaked. They are available. They will be in the data sets that people can download publicly. But I think this question is really about how do you know that they're there to go looking for those data? And two of my favorite places to go is for any survey looking at the final report, the final questionnaires, household, women's and men's questionnaires, are always published as an appendix in that final report. And so you can see the full instrument that was used for data collection in each survey report. The other place is the survey search function on the DHS website itself. And at the DHS website under methodology, the methodology tab, which is one of our major categories on our website, there is a survey characteristics search. And this is a very useful tool to look up which surveys have been implemented recently, where data has recently been made available, and what modules have been included in that survey beyond the core questionnaire. And I believe Sarah has, thank you very much, just dropped the link to that survey search in the chat bar. So those are the two places to go.
And to add a new resource that is just starting to be rolled out is a questionnaire search database. Currently, this database contains malaria indicator surveys, MIS surveys, in English only, but it is being expanded to include other surveys. As we have time and resources, that database will be updated continually. And that would allow you to search the questionnaire and response options for terms or phrases to also identify surveys where different topics of your interest would be available. And that link, yes, is the question database at dhsprogram.com.
Okay, another question from the chat. To clarify, the data are owned by the country and not the DHS program, correct? And it's local individuals who serve as the data collectors as opposed to individuals from outside the country, correct?
Yes, the DHS program exists to provide technical assistance to countries to implement the survey, but the survey data are ultimately a product of the implementing agency and host government themselves.
And yes, everyone who is involved in implementing the survey, from the interviewers to field supervisors to local data editors, are employed by the implementing agency. They're engaged by the implementing agency in a particular country, and they're residents of that country.
A reminder, anyone is welcome to raise their hand to ask a question. One question from the chat I've seen is, have you considered organizing convenings of NSOs and other stakeholders, including LGBT CSOs, within a region or set of countries? Creating broad networks would be helpful to deal with all of those concerns you raised.
I think this is an excellent point, and yes, something that we want to take into consideration moving forward. During the design process, we do try to make sure that it's inclusive of all of the various stakeholders and groups who have an interest in the data being collected in the survey. And I think this is an important point, that on this topic, there are organizations that have specific local knowledge about this that need to be included if these sort of things were being adapted in the specific survey. So great point, thank you.
So the next question, do you have examples of what safeguarding can look like for participants who may be responding as a sexual or gender minority? Are there overarching principles you've put in place, or has it largely been determined by DHS implementing partners in country?
Great question, and something that I think everyone who implements surveys takes very, very seriously. As the DHS program, we have put together standard materials and guidance for the survey overall, and a part of that is, as Sarah mentioned, a full review by the institutional ethical research boards in the United States and in the country implementing the survey. And in that, we outlined all of the protections that are in place for respondents and interviewers. As Carrie mentioned, all of the data are kept private. They're encrypted when they're transmitted over the internet, and all of the personal identifying information, or PII, is kept to a limited group of people and removed when shared anywhere else. A large part of the interviewer or field worker training does cover how to be sensitive to the context of entering someone's home and asking very personal questions. A standard DHS includes a number of topics that are very sensitive to individuals, and of course, what is sensitive to one individual might be different than another individual. And so on this topic of sexual and gender minority specific questions, I think we do need to be very, very careful and put together additional guidelines on how training needs to be adapted and what needs to be covered and what needs to be addressed if survey was going to field this. I think in the cases that we've shown here, those implementing agencies undertook some of that contextualization and sensitization during the field worker training. And I think we also need to learn more about how that can be better improved.
On a related point, there was a question about explaining the data displacement as you were talking about the protections about encryption and removing identifying information. Could you also talk about briefly about GPS data displacement, Blake?
Yes. So most surveys do collect some sort of location information as a part of the survey, and those data are available for research and analysis purposes. But the location information that is collected is usually just one point at the center of a cluster or a geographic area that covers multiple households. And before those data are released, that point is randomly displaced within specific parameters to further ensure that no one can trace back to a specific area, specific household, or in a specific person. So that's one of the protections that are put in place. And Carrie, I think if you want to add some more about the protections that we have in place sort of standardly and for other topics, that might be helpful.
Sure. So one of the experiences that we can draw on has been from our experiences in developing and implementing the domestic violence module, which is a common module that's added to DHS surveys. Because of the sensitive nature of that topic and wanting to make sure that we are protecting every respondent, surveys that implement the domestic violence module undertake additional precautions above and beyond the standard core DHS questionnaire. And these include things like additional training, much more intensive training for that module with the interviewers than perhaps other parts of the questionnaire. Things like being very strict with our privacy conditions, making sure that that the interviewer is continually scanning for any potential invasions of privacy during that portion of the interview, and affirming that privacy conditions were maintained. We also interview only one woman per household with the domestic violence module, even if there are multiple women who are eligible. All women would get the standard core woman's questionnaire, but the DV module would only be for one woman in the household. And We often do not situate the men's survey in the same households that are selected for women with the domestic violence module. And so we can take some of the experiences that we've had in developing these protocols for protection to examine what is transferable, what makes sense for similar additional precautions for interviewing questions around sexual and gender minorities, where they differ and where we need to draw upon some different experiences or come up with something new. So this is something that we have experience with already, and it's just kind of a matter of sharing across sort of topic areas and experiences to see what would be needed in any given particular application.
Yeah, and again, we're open to learning from others, because we know that there are other organizations and other surveys who have perhaps more experience in the area of collecting data, specifically amongst gender and sexual minorities. So if there's anybody here who has a specific experience and they want to share that with us, please feel free to do that now, or you can send us an email later or fill out the survey.
Yes, thank you, Blake. We would, with our remaining time, we'd like to pivot the discussion to folks' perceived data needs or data gaps in this area. We also invite anyone to share their experiences or lessons learned collecting survey data on the topic of sexual and gender minorities. What do you think is the most important data needs or data gaps in this area?
I know from the survey that we sent out and from the responses we received so far, a number of people said that they would like to use these type of data in their work or where they work, but it's often not available either because of sample size or because of geographic coverage. Are there other limitations to your ability to use these desired data?
Some of the responses that we saw come in through the survey include health data is important to understand the health disparities experienced by the SGM population, including HIV/AIDS, mental health, substance abuse, and chronic diseases. Data on access to healthcare, health behaviors, and outcomes are also critical. Oh, we have a hand raised.
Hi, yes, you can now come off of mute, Bawala.
Are you able to get me now?
Yes, we hear you.
All right. Yeah. So like I mentioned, this is Bwalia. I'm originally from Zambia and now at Vase University in South Africa. So I'm one of the people that regularly uses the demographic health survey whenever we're having classes with my students. So one of the issues I think that I can try to raise here is that as much as a country, we are not collecting this data, on sexual minorities from my country, Zambia. I totally understand that it has got a lot of implications on trying to design programs or coming up with projects that can help to, for example, deal with health issues that come with people who are with sexual minorities in terms of maybe HIV, AIDS, or sexually transmitted related diseases. Or now we can design programs just to help these people with who are oriented differently from what is considered to be normal. Now the issue is, if we're unable to collect this data as a country and based on the laws that we have as a country, it becomes extremely difficult to deal with HIV-related prevention measures because DHS presents a huge chunk of information that we use as a country to design programs that can help us in dealing with such problems. So as DHS program, for example, working with the National Statistical Office from my home country, how then can we design or come up with questions that can really help in coming up with solutions to such a group of people who enjoy other basic rights, but based on the constitution that we have, we can't ask such questions. I raise my case.
Thank you. And I think that's a very important point. And I notice that it's come up a couple of times. And so it's something we do want to consider as a project and to ensure that all stakeholders consider the contextualization of any sort of questions and how they might impact respondents and interviewers. So as Carrie mentioned, there are some ways in which we can learn from other topics and to maybe apply those lessons learned here. But I think there's still a lot that needs to be understood during that design preparation phase in order to make an informed decision that is in the best interest of the survey and the population that the survey is intending to serve. So thank you for that.
One of the things that I have been thinking about is that it might be a very different matter to be pursuing additional data collection within the context of a general population survey, such as the DHS, versus a specific targeted data collection effort within a given sexual and gender minorities community specifically, that we might think about designing such a survey differently. But that's not to say that there's not a lot that we can't learn, or rather just to avoid the double negative there. There is a lot that we can learn potentially from specific targeted surveys or other data collection experiences to see how that might inform what we would do in a survey mechanism like the DHS, both in terms of how we construct the questions, as well as what types of training and other supports that might be needed to support this type of national survey. And I think part of that comment was also to invite someone, if there's anyone who has experience with these more sort of targeted specific population types of surveys, we would love to hear about your experiences with that as well, because I think that would have some there's a lot that we could learn in adapting something for a general population survey.
Feel free to raise your hand to ask a question. One question from the chat that also relates to perceived data needs or data gaps. Very interesting in reference to the examples. You briefly mentioned one in Colombia having positive impacts on programming. Can you describe in more detail how these examples, the SOGI data, led to more inclusive policies or programs, interventions, or policies? Overall, I'm curious how we can better connect data collection to its usage, especially for more inclusive policies. And I can start by briefly answering that any topic or question to be included in the DHS program should have a data use plan. Data are meant to be used. And I think careful consideration needs to be taken at the survey design stage in thinking about specifically what the intent is to use these data. But I'll let Blake and Carrie jump in with any thoughts they might have as well.
I can just
would
add on the, sorry.
Go ahead, Blake.
On the Columbia example, the information that was used from that survey was in relation to perceptions and comprehensive knowledge about comprehensive sexual education knowledge specifically. And so that was found to be quite low. And so the government used that to inform this larger comprehensive sexual education programming that they planned out. I am not sure if there were other results from that survey that were used. That there might be, but I'm not aware of them at this point. But Carrie?
I was just going to say that I would definitely reiterate that point that we collect data because we want those data to be useful and used. And I wanted to kind of go back to one of the questions that Sarah read out from the chat earlier on about health disparities and as a data gap and needing to examine what some of the disparities are across these populations, across the population writ large. And knowing that we have a concern with sample sizes in some cases, I wanted to get some input on which types of health disparities are we most interested in examining. Mental health was raised there. We've been doing this for some time in the area of sexually transmitted infections and so on. But what beyond that, what areas are most pressing to look for and identify health disparities?
So we welcome your continued input. You can put your response to that question or the other questions into the survey, or you can send us an email. You can respond to the Zoom registration email. But we want to close now. We're at the end of our time together. I want to thank everybody for the robust conversation and for the participation in this webinar. We're sorry if we didn't get to your specific questions, but I think we found this collectively very helpful and informative. I wanted to quickly just mention that some of the next steps that the DHS program is undertaking. So we've been documenting the experiences of the surveys that we shared here with you. And as we learn from these experiences, we've also held discussions with experts on these topics at other organizations. If you have experience that you want to share, please reach out to us, and we'd love to talk. Over the course of this next year, later in the year, we intend to hold a technical consultation with experts to help finalize these recommendations that Kristen mentioned on the DHS program standard recommendations around the inclusion of sexual and gender minorities in a DHS survey. So we're very excited about the possibilities that the future holds, and we again thank everyone for their attendance.
And if you haven't had a chance already, please do take the time to fill out our survey. You can give us your thoughts in detail. Thank you, everyone.